Hi, Sean.
Hey, Sarah.
So, y'all, this is a really profound moment because I'm about to introduce you to one of my absolute favorite humans on the planet. And that's saying a lot because I know a lot of incredible people all over the world. And yeah, I'm just really excited to introduce Sean to you. Sean Tebor, he's my friend, he's my mentor, and now he's practically family. And I could go on and on talking about how incredible he is before we dive in, but honestly, his words and his work are totally going to speak for themselves. So I'm just going to temper my accolades as much as I can for now, and just know that his impact on my life personally is pretty freaking infinite. And we'll just dive in.
Yay.
So, this podcast is all about the paradigm shift that we need to make on the planet right now. And you're a huge part of the paradigm shift in my own personal life, and and in all aspects of my being, really a profound impact on all of that. And so I just want to open this by asking you this question of what is that evolutionary leap that humans need to make in order to move into this new paradigm?
Yeah. Simply, if I could put it as simply as possible, it would be to consciously embody, to fully feel again our energy, our intelligence, our creativity, our access and embodiment as source, as nature, as the cosmos, in a way that's not separate from mind, that is held and understood and felt in its truth of its right sequence, its right polarity, how energy flows in the body. And, that's the baseline. That's the baseline. And there's so much we have to really alchemize the ego. We have to alchemize the hierarchies. We have to alchemize and distill from everything that's in place lovingly. We have to draw from that, as so many teachers and so many practitioners of many modalities and philosophers have been doing for some time. But the real paradigm shift, really, we have to feel it. We have to feel it. And I feel like we can think our way only so far, and the mind is not responsible for making that paradigm shift. The mind is part of it. But what I find lacking again and again, where I've been so compelled, both in my own life and with all the people that I work with, is just how little we're feeling below the heart, especially. So it's this kind of return to, if we bring where animal is seen as less than, and there's a hierarchy of mind over animal, or the higher mind is something special is going on. But what is that based in, and what does that mean? So we can reconverge, we can reunite, and inhabit our midline. Okay, which I love to talk about. So the paradigm shift is really all of that, but the simplest is to return to what we really are, to remember and feel what we really are, and to start again. Not over. We don't have to go back. We're not going back. We're re-evolving. It's a revolution in that way. RE-evolution.
Yeah, and there's something that you do when it comes to sort of this embodiment practice that I've been practicing alongside you for the last over 10 years, is the way that you bring it into the bones and into the cellular level, so that I am literally raising the consciousness of my own body on a deep, deep, deep cellular subtle level.
Yeah. So thank you. So the invitation is always to step back away from the kind of, and I'm generalizing, the cultural model of achievement, of making something happen, of thinking our way through, of even conceptualizing our way through. When I work with folks and we start to move again, what we're doing is we're really in a practice of allowance. We're in a practice of remembrance. And I hear this word a lot lately. It's really inspiring to me to hear so many people in different fields of awakening using this word remembrance, because it's already there. So the intelligence that we are, the master blueprint, the slowly evolving hundreds of thousands of years and more of evolution, at least in the human model, the human species is so complex and rich. So we start talking about movement. We start talking about, we have to shift our baseline. We have to reorient through remembrance, which means largely in our culture, there's such a huge abyssal gap. There's a huge abyssal gap between where the mind is hanging out and where the gut is hanging out, for example, and where the feet are hanging out. I mean, I heard, I can't remember his name. There's a beautiful British man on TEDx who gave a talk, and he was talking about education. He's talking about the young people of the world and education. He said basically a lot of people are under the premise that the body exists to move the mind from meeting to meeting, and that's its function. Okay. And now it's to move from meeting to meeting while sitting in a car or sitting in an airplane or sitting at a desk. And so this is really, conscious embodiment is the practice of remembrance and allowance to come back to what we innately know. So for example, in the language that I'm currently using, the container of embodied keys, we talk about human shapes, like standing or sitting or crouching or lunging or squatting. And instead of posing, right, instead of a destination where we're perfecting or sculpting in so much brilliance that destination, it's really much more about the fact that innately we're not so much posers as we are movers. And so when we get into the shape of standing and we start to pulse, we start to rhythmically explore with many levels of awareness and navigation, we begin to explore that shape. And what's beginning to happen is we realize, so many practitioners share this with me too. They come to me, they're like, 25 years of yoga, or, whatever the art is, how they entered the movement practice, all of them beautiful, all of them valid. We come to a place of just, what is movement? And so when we look at the bones, we look at the geometries, the sacred geometries of the body, we realize that while we're standing on 2 feet, which might be relatively new in the human paradigm, evolutionarily, being upright on 2 feet, is that we start to tone and we move, we explore, we push and pull our environment internally and externally. And we recall very quickly, it starts to stir. There's this deep, deep stir, right, at a cellular level. And it doesn't take much, 2 or 3 minutes of this rhythmical movement within a shape, and then have someone lay down, a whole class lay down and just feel and see what comes up. And by observing so many people for so long, whether it was in the martial arts or in yoga, and now through the work I'm doing now, which is just human movement, it's functional movement as functional medicine, I'm seeing the same patterns of the gap between the head and the root, okay, the head and the core. And I also see a reversal of the flow of information, well, pre-information, pre-formation, creative energy or potentiality is trying to flow up the midline, but it's blocked. It's blocked right around the diaphragm. And so what we have is this friction between the brilliance of the mind and the brilliance of the gut. And our culture is holding the mind over the gut to a point where it's toxic. It's actually, in a way, it's threatening us. It's killing us. If we don't let it go and reset the natural flow and polarity of the midline, for example, it flows up, the exterior flows down. We could go endlessly into that rabbit hole. Then we're going to continue to struggle. And so movement is a way to yoke, and that's the union. The yoga is to yoke the upper mind and the lower mind, if we want to call it that. What does that mean? What does that have to do with the midline, the axial body, the axis mundi, or the Sushumna in yoga? So it's fascinated me all my life, feeling this innate warmth and possibility of expression in all the forms, whether it's movement or it's dialogue or it's music or what have you, it's dance. That connection has always inspired me decades before I ever really had the interest in sharing it and the language with which to do that.
Mm.
Yeah.
Wow. So conscious embodiment, That's the paradigm shift that we need to make as humans. I remember when I first encountered you, like I can never remember the exact time, but it was when I was living in Atlanta, 12 years ago or so, and I encountered you through my portal was yoga, was coming in through yoga, and when in coming to your workshops, completely turned everything that I had learned on its head about my physical practice. And then what's so cool about that, so what that means too is like that whole concept of stretching gets completely shifted. We don't stretch. Like, what other animals that are functionally moving on this planet are just stretching? They're reaching, right? I'm sorry, I'm waxing Sean. He's sitting here smiling like, ah, yes, grasshopper.
Love it.
Animals will reach and they'll pendiculate when they yawn, and but they're so engaged whenever they're yawning and when they're doing something that resembles a stretch. There's an engagement there. It has completely like transformed the body. And when you talk about sort of that midline and that place where the energy gets stuck right around the diaphragm, that's the place where I have an ongoing dialogue and mantra that you've taught me of like, okay, so I've got that pelvic tilt and now I breathe into my kidneys. And what does that do? There's always a metaphor in everything that you show us or teach. There's always a metaphor. If I'm breathing into my kidneys, I'm releasing fear, which then does even more energetically to help that flow move, that creative divine flow move through the body.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautifully shared. So the gap that we describe between the cerebral mind and the intuitive mind, right, is also exacerbated by a culture that is more and more separated from nature. Okay. So there you have your metaphor. I'm always looking for ways I have to inspire myself. When you're in a safe space, you're in your house, and you're in your practice space, and you've got the incense burning and everything's clear, and you're like, wow, this is amazing. The phone is off. You've got, an hour or half an hour or what have you. How do you bring that natural event, that complex natural function to that practice? And this is why embody keys. But to more specifically answer your question, or to reflect, is that we're the only species on the planet that just stretches. And it's actually been shown relatively recently. The science is coming up. I've shared with you before that I feel like kind of there's a movement renaissance going on. And what I mean by that is I'm studying strength training for the past 6 years, gravity work and calisthenics and such. And it's complementing the mobility practice of the groundwork that we do in the keys. And lots of people are getting really smart. They're coming back to this word function. Okay. And so what's really interesting about just stretch, because I don't want to go too far into that direction, because that's a whole episode by itself of how we can help by lifting the awareness of what it is to stretch. If we're the only species that are stretching, why? Okay. So we have to look at our complex patterns of stress, of entanglement, of egoic attachment. I mean, it's all in the body. It's all in the body. So you've heard me joke around in class, like, what if the cheetah was like eyeing the gazelle, and the cheetah's like, could you hold on a second? I need to stretch first. So the cheetah's over there, like, opening up its hamstrings before it bolts at 65, 70 miles an hour. Of course, that's absurd. They just go. So the thing about stretch is it's actually, we're pulling the tissue without its functional intelligence of what it is that we're doing. So if we're sitting on the floor and we're pulling on the hamstrings, for example, in Janu Shirshasana, seated forward bend, it's dissociated from its function. The hamstrings are meant to work while they length. So we start looking at the complex contractions, eccentric, concentric, static contraction that are all functional. And when that cat, you use the word pendiculation, I love it that you brought that up. Like Thomas Hanna talks about in somatics, talks about what even domesticated animals will contract their every fiber in their body, like statistically, like over 40 times a day. And what they're doing in just a few seconds is resetting their entire brain body relationship and conversation and the sensory motor cortex on top of the human cranium, very similar to the cats and the dogs, right? It's resetting that whole thing where usually there's discord, there's miscommunication or lack of communication. What is also called, Thomas calls sensory motor amnesia, okay, is another way of the embodied pattern of the mind being one place and the body being another. We can't even feel what we need to do to turn on the buttocks, to turn on the belly properly.
Well, and that reminds me of another thing that you are constantly saying in class or in our one-on-one work. And that is, it's about sort of the leading with the pelvis and the empowerment and simultaneous relaxation of the pelvis. So can you talk a little bit more about what that means to have the pelvis be sort of that root and that sort of initiation point?
Wow, beautiful. So if we look at the midline or the mid space, if we look at this longitudinal axial human awareness that's been held in various practices in the East for thousands of years, it's the central Nadi in yoga, Sushumna, one of the 8 principal rays of the sun. And if we go ahead and remember that, that's a huge practice unto itself. How does someone inhabit their midline? Okay. If we can open that back up again, and we look at how the mid-space, midline actually flows up as potentiality gathers, as it rolls up through the inseams of the legs, for example, okay, reaches the pelvic floor, and this first chakra intelligence, this great gateway is like, okay, do we have the right to be, to use Anadea's translations from Eastern Body, Western Mind? Are we connected to the earth? Do we have permission to be, the right to be nourished, loved, sheltered? And so what happens is we realize that that flow of energy is upwards. It's upwards. So the pelvis is actually experiencing the sequential movement of the breath of life as potential creative expression before the upper body. That's why, depending on which model you look at, those energies move up through the central axis. And then as things come into being, that's that auric field, or that's that biomagnetic field, or that's the torus, the tree of life, right? The midline is rising, the exterior is descending, and round it goes. That has a certain polarity to it, or it's the better word, I think, is sequence, because polarization will often invoke, neutral or friction between the two poles. We want to feel that the potentiality rises up from underneath us, gathers into the body. And when we get to the pelvis, this very special place within the midline experience, we're actually beginning to feel, even before the pelvis, but the pelvis is the first prismatic translator of this light or energy as it moves up into being in the moment, which is then felt by the second and third chakras, like the first and second chakras, the right to be and the right to feel. Just to use that language, because it's really what's up for us, the right to be and the right to feel. Then we can act, and then we can love, and then we can speak, et cetera, to use that metaphor. But on a bigger scale, Sarah, the pelvis needs to be re-empowered and returned to its right place in our way of life. And what that means is this brain is actually designed to first listen to and reflect on what is being experienced bottom up. The intellectual mind, manas, can translate that and share that. And then we have the stroke of the poet's pen. We have the stroke of the artist's brush. We have the dancer. We have art. Okay. When the mind is thrilled by the capacity of the possibility of translating the divine, but that's felt first in the pelvis. So I joke in class, because I have to keep it light. When we start talking about the pelvis, a lot of people, can bolt for the proverbial door, because that's where all the trauma is too. It's in the gut. It's in the pelvis. It's in it. Of course, it's everywhere, but that's where the root of it is in the gut. We're talking about microbiome. We're talking about gut health. We're talking about gut-brain axis.
When we first started working together, when I first met you, I had a lot of gut issues, and So there's a way in which you're sort of almost like a medical intuitive as well, right? Because the work that you do actually has an impact, a ripple impact, not just on sort of one's yoga practice, but also on the microbiome and on sort of living on purpose in one's life in an aligned way that is, sort of in that midline.
Yeah. Yeah. And I only, medical intuitive is something that Munai likes to really play with, my beloved. And it's only because I keep seeing the same patterns.
Yeah.
You start to know what that dysbiotic state looks like, and you start to get into the dicey conversation about nutrition, and you start to understand there's a difference between fit and consciously embodied. And consciously embodied is much, much deeper. I mean, they're both the same. Ultimately, ideally, fit would mean the same thing, but I think we associate fit as just the body, and and then the mind. Or the mind needs more life force or more capacity, so tune up the body. And they're still, again, they're separated. Okay.
Well, and that's where we get into the integration piece, which you also speak a lot about.
Yeah. So in the content of Embody Keys, we have human shapes. Just a quick outline to give context to this conversation is that we enter through relatively familiar human shapes. There's just 7. It's like just standing, folding, crouching, lunging, squatting, sitting, and laying down, or being horizontal. And within those shapes, we move, we tone, we bring strength and resist ourselves as we yield. We're babies again, pushing and pulling. But unlike Alexander or Feldenkrais, which are fantastic somatic systems, we're much more engaged. We're really exploring by listening to the joints and listening to what we're experiencing while we're in it. And then when we rest during integration time between these engaged moments, we're opening the field. But it's really how we navigate that space consciously. And then we get to what's our function within this movement? So these are layers of content in the Embodied Keys containers. We have shapes, that's the entry. We have navigations. We have function, push and pull, etc. But then it's the integration keys. It's like, what's our level of running in the background primal awareness of breath? What's our baseline orientation within the body? What another integration key is pelvic awareness. Are we in the pivot? Are we in the core, the hara, the core engine where the translation is beginning to happen in the moment from potentiality into being? So our primal function is up here. We're talking about what is, rather than being a practitioner of conscious embodiment or a leader of a conscious concierge as yourself, whatever we call ourselves in the world, what is our primal function? And it appears to me over and over and over again that, like the rest of nature, it's almost comical to hear it as I say it, that our primal purpose is to come into being. And that actually works a certain way. And the 3D experience that seems so now in the conversations of spiritualism is so reduced. Oh, I want 4D, I want 5D. No, it's all unified, right? It's all unified. It doesn't work that way. The 3D is the experiential integration domain. And really all these are, instead of someplace else, again, more hierarchy, more separation. These are just perspectives of the now, right? So we need the embodiment is not something to be transcended. It's not gross matter that is less intelligent than where we're going. The body that you're in right now that I can see through the screen, every single cell in your system is a vibrating, orchestrated symphony of creative expression of source. It's emergent right now. And it will always be evolving, because maybe consciousness itself is evolving through the experience of the self-reflective experience of nature. So integration, yeah, I know. It's like integration is really the practice. And that is going all the way back to the beginning. That is really kind of the catalyst. The practices of integration are integrating all the layers that we've created for ourselves of mind, body, spirit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. the integration is the real catalyst to return us back to the paradigm shift, because it's really what we mean by being re-evolutionary is get back on the evolutionary track.
Yeah.
And what does that have to do with the body? Everything. Because we have to feel it more and more and more subtly, like down to these fibers and those bones. And then there's, whoa, wait, that's energy? Or is that blood? Is that lymphatic? And then it's chemistry. And then it's the vibration of molecules. Then, so we have cells, and then we have molecules. And then wait a minute, the subtlest level of interface where formless and form are tickling each other is the quantum. And that's timeless and spaceless. And now we're talking about at that quantum interface, that quantum threshold, we're talking about where we really start to redesign without the egoic control. We start to redesign as source what source intends, which is to come into being.
To come into being consciously in these bodies, and we can engage, get out of the way and engage with that consciousness.
Exactly. It's both. We're both, the practice of allowance is a re-engagement of life. It's to alchemize the ego, where the ego is not driving the bus. Discernment is driving the bus. And we put the pelvis back in charge. And I was saying, I lost the thread, but earlier, like in class, we talk about do everything pelvis first, everything butt first, which gets a laugh. But it's true. When the head succumbs to the intelligence that's rising up through the core, through the heart, up through the voice, into the reflective mirror capacity of the mind, and the intellect is going, wow, that's amazing. Did I create that? Well, if the ego is involved, no. Yes and no. It's tangled up. But it's that clarity of like, oh my God, we're going for the ride as human beings, but we're also the creator. It's both.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot about how our culture has been for, years, whether that's hundreds or thousands of years, has been bypassing this process. And we see that a lot now. I mean, we've talked about this, but we see that a lot now in talking about things like biohacking.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you can speak to a little bit how what you're talking about now, how that integration and that sort of that total paradigm shift where we're turning it all almost upside down from what we thought it was. And yeah, how do you sort of see where we've been with this sort of bypassing of embodiment? How do you see us shifting that now?
That's such a good question. It's really the loving acknowledgement and recognition of where we've been and accepting that, whether we want to call it the path we took with ancient Rome and the movement away from the mystery schools of ancient Egypt and ancient Greece and everything that was before that. Whatever the path has been, it seems to be like Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, that there's this innocence and then there's this rich, complex context of life, which we're going to call the movement of the ego, of finding our place in the world. We go through and we have all this experience and we eventually maybe come back around into wisdom. I feel like as a species, we're starting to see the path is clearing. We're arriving back to the ocean again. We're coming back. And why? And we don't need to go fully into this in this moment, but I just want to point to, for me personally, where all of this has really become extraordinarily and exquisitely magical is through the work of alchemizing my own personal ego, which is a lifelong experience. It's going to always be happening, but that was placed right at the center of my practice. And because I started recognizing, wow, when I'm in egoic space, I'm charged, I'm possessed in a way, and being able to have enough discernment to watch myself turn into this crazy ape crazy, whatever, not demonizing it at all, but it's just to lose myself to this other thing and to really understand the machinations of that and why is that going on and how is that so damaging, and the difference between, for example, restraint, try to hold it back and let it go, to right release. That's a whole other matter. When we understand how the ego works, we start to understand the bypass, because the bypass is where we think and are held in a culture, and again, I'm generalizing, where academia and intellectual intelligence supersede and actually at this point cap and veil the intuitive intelligence. Okay. And so what do? We realize when the ego, I remember when it was explained to me, I think it was actually Eckhart Tolle was talking about why the ego is always making a fuss. Why is it always looking for trouble? And when he gets to the point where he's like, it's looking for trouble because it has to recreate itself constantly because it knows it doesn't exist. I was like, it was one of those moments where I was just floored, where that epiphany of like this outside translation brilliantly from Eckhart and the innate knowing within me met. They kissed each other and I was like, Shazam. and I love those moments, right? So the bypass is a compensation that the ego makes by cutting off its roots, because it's got this. It's got this. So we're going to biohack. We're going to play God without being conscious enough to know, to feel how we don't have intuitive pretext for that hacking. Do you understand? So without that intuitive pre-sight, like Einstein said, that people talk about, he felt relativity before he had the math to prove it. And he wasn't even that good at math. Are you kidding me? That we know what that feels like. You know what that feels like when you have that pang of thrill where you get something before this gets something. And then we might spend some time and contemplate and reflect and revisit that, or we create a painting. But the mind waits and it's like, oh, now I can translate. The bypass is where we insert, their ego inserts its will, reappropriating the power of intellect and discernment for its own false sense of self. It inserts itself in the natural process of the flow of intuition to intellect and starts creating for itself. And why? To live longer lives, to make more money, to do all these things that are ultimately control-based, okay, without the intuition that I know in my bones is necessary to do that as a source exploration rather than a mind's egoic exploration. They are vastly different. Okay. Hence pelvis first. Yeah.
I mean, the implications of all this are just are astounding. I mean, like, because you talk about sort of the quantum level, this micro level, that then in going to that quantum level, you also then become super macro, right? And so there's always a metaphor of the molecular and cellular all the way out to the freaking cosmic, with all the work that we talk about and that you're doing.
Yeah, and it's really cool. It's really amazing, actually. It could almost be seen as miraculous. I've seen so many people have this moment of a simple reorientation, a shift of perspective, where, for example, you've seen it. You're on the gymnastics rings and you're doing, inverted rows or whatever. And we're struggling from the exterior, that macro space. We're struggling from what the mind thinks this should be. And that's okay. That's part of the process. So we're pulling up, we're doing our thing, and it's just so heavy. And we get to that 8th rep and it starts to slow down. And then I'm like, all right, hold on a second, just go back and just pause. And then we reorient the mind to one language is the lower dantian, right? Dahara. We go back to the sacral pelvis or the deep belly. And that's a personal, unique biolocation for everybody. And I'm creating metaphor, imagine yourself tied to the cosmos, countless threads. There's a beautiful, look it up. There's a beautiful sonnet by Robert Frost called The Silken Tent. It's actually in Anatomy Trains. Thomas Thomas Meyer's book, where there's a description where you're connected to everything by countless threads. And as soon as someone on the rings goes there and they drop their gravity center from mind here to mind in the belly, they start going, their reps get so easy and they start flying, they're lighter. And that's real. That's a reorganization of all the cells in their function, because the gravity center has been replaced or rebooted in the core where it belongs. When we're mind only or mind over everything else, we're top heavy. We have a top-down programming that is backwards from the upward flow of the midline. So that makes things more difficult. That thing makes things much more difficult. I have a really funny story. Remind me to tell you sometime. It's too long for this, but it's really about my friend George, who rode his bike, and by relaxing, he blew his times out of the water. He didn't even look at the clock.
I'm so when I hear this from you, when I talk with you, it helps me to feel sort of more optimistic, right? Because we think about, like, if we can make this paradigm shift at an individual level, what does it look like? And that might be a whole other hour-long conversation. But what does that look like on the collective? What does that look like if a critical mass of people are starting to consciously embody, are starting to really tap into that lower dantian and having that quantum level power? And if that can happen, because otherwise the world feels pretty hopeless. But when you think about the possibility that people could actually tap into this and it can suddenly become effortless.
Yeah. And I think we would all be pretty bonkers if we hadn't experienced something like what you just described at least a few times in our lives. And we know what it feels like. I feel like we innately know what it feels like to stand in our own way. That's why, I've, as you know, for years I've been wondering, like, how do we share this, like, with more people? And here we are. But how do we share this feeling innately that through working with so many people and watching the same patterns of fear and grief, how they manifest in the body, how the ego works against our natural evolution, how, we relate to ourselves as, the story can get cleaned up. What's so unbelievable to me is that how close I can feel we are, how proximal a global shift is via the simple desire to let go of all these things that somehow we've tricked ourselves into that we need to carry, and to get back to right release is the pathway back into the pelvis, back into intuition and instinct, to really understand without judgment, to just really drop into our zero space. It's not a point, it's a space, our neutral space, and just be. I remember listening to Osho. He's like, just watch, not dispassionately, not disconnected, not irresponsibly, but when we, as when we get on those rings and we do that set of whatever, or we're in the key of folding and we're moving like monkeys, just like so strong, like moving the earth. We actually metaphorically move the planet now when we're lovingly moving the planet.
I love
she
that.
loves it, right?
Yeah, it's like,
and then we lay down and everybody's totally. But in this is a dance that is the technology of inertial awareness, where we're turning on our flesh, we're turning on bicep and tricep, or the front and the back of the arm, same time, so to create like a mime, that self tension, that biofeedback that gives us a sense of where we are and how to feel. And then we 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and then we lay down. And everybody in the room is just like activated, and they're just breathing. And I'm watching bodies, and everybody's so ready.
And that's when we can feel every cell of our body.
That's the whole point. Intramuscular coordination is one element of function. Okay. Intramuscular coordination, intracellular coordination. Every fiber is articulating. That's pandiculation. Pan-articulating pandiculation. Everything is on. We're celebrating. We're actually committed to the moment, literally engaging the moment, not to seek some outcome, but to to engage completely and have that experience of being deeply, deeply stirred, deeply touched at that, as deep as we can go. And then we lay down and we're like, not checking out, we're checking in.
Yeah.
And we're like,
oh my God,
are like so ready
yeah,
to really, it all comes up. Sometimes it's joy, it's ecstasy, it's trauma. We look at Peter Levine's work and Waking the Tiger and like the whole thing about how animals move trauma. It's really what we're doing in a slower, deeply engaged way. Of course, animals kick it. They're fully engaged. They're pulsing in pendiculation. There's so much. It's so rich. And so again, coming back again to this, I want to reiterate this again. We are ready. We are ready to more or less to fall back to what is much more ancient. The lineage that I'm fascinated by is human evolution and the planetary evolution. I'm fascinated by how evolution gave us the rotator cuff and the hip joint. And that's a technical dive, but I'm interested in the sacred geometries of human beings. And why are we bypassing the intimate awareness that is provided by this celestial machine that sends these signals up to the brain? And the bypass of the brain is going, nah, I've got this. I'm going to do it this way, and interfere. Yeah, I could just go and go and go.
I like the celestial machine. I like that. I'm so grateful for my celestial machine. How cool.
Right?
So you have a body of work that you have created. So I've known you for, like I said, I think 12 years, give or take. And as I've known you during that time, it started out through sort of a very out of the box yoga style. And then I kind of got to know the martial arts side of you, because you have almost 20 years of yoga, almost 20 years of martial arts. And now you've created your own body of work called Embody Keys. And you teach locally, like you've lived in Santa Fe, so you have a community in Santa Fe, and now you're in Maui. We're in Maui. I came to Maui. Yay. And you've got your peeps here that you work with too, in this modality called Embody Keys, which you've definitely touched on it quite a bit. But I'm wondering if folks want to learn more about that, they can go and find you at embodykeys.com.
So if listeners want to know more, you can visit embodykeys.com. And there's some subscription content on there, some great videos, some introductions to some of the shapes, how we move within the shapes. It's really fun. And you can contact me through the website as well, Sean at Embody Keys. And it feels really good. And you've been in this journey with me, Sarah. It's really fun to see it drop into this place that, as part of the movement renaissance, we get to relax into what we know and get to work.
Beautiful. It's an honor to have been alongside you these more recent years. So thank you for having me. And y'all, the online work at embodykeys.com is a beautiful introduction to Sean's work. And if you ever have the opportunity to work with Sean in person in Maui, in Santa Fe, or wherever his body and heart may lead him, I highly recommend doing so. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Sean.
Sarah, thank you. Thank you for what you do and who you are. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, Thursday. Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to more.
Me too. All right, y'all. Have a beautiful day. Thanks for listening.
Blessings.